So to begin our 2-minute opening, we'll start with the incumbent, Representative Mary Peltola, followed by Mr. Begich.
Thank you, Michelle. Just making sure my mic's on. Okay. Willow! That was especially for this front table. When I was here 2 years ago, we started by recognizing the passing of our longtime Congressman, Congressman Don Young. I can tell you that today, Don Young is still working for Alaska and for all of us. The $8.2 billion, I'll repeat that, $8.2 billion that our senators and I have secured in the last 2 years is part of Don's legacy, a legacy of putting Alaskans first and delivering for Alaskans. I have moved historic Don Young bills forward this Congress, like the Power 2.0 Act, legislation to establish an ambassador for Arctic Affairs, expand WIC-eligible foods, and more. After nearly 30 years of waiting, I was able to secure the repeal for the Willow Project. We know that resource development is crucial for our economy and national security, and we simply cannot rely on foreign sources of energy. I am the advocate for the resource industry in Washington, D.C. I've spoken out against this administration's attempts to slow down exploration and production. I've rallied the Blue Dog Democrats and worked with the Western Caucus Republicans. Western Caucus is 106 Republicans and me. To end the LNG export pause. I've opposed this administration's policies in ANWR and NPRA and have gotten North Slope stakeholders who this administration had ignored audiences with the most senior leaders at the Department of Interior, and I will always stand up for Alaska and our interests. I'm proud to have taken concrete action to support our state's energy needs. I've championed initiatives to expedite the permitting process, invest in critical infrastructure, and provide training and support for our skilled workforce. And I have co-sponsored legislation to protect gas-powered utilities and led the call for permitting reform and permitting by rule reform with my Republican colleague Celeste Malloy.
Thank you, Representative Peltola.
Thank you.
Mr. Begich.
We're a resource state. Whether it's oil and gas, mineral development, timber, fishing, or even tourism, we make our living on resources. And I will tell you right now, in the Congress, there will be no better friend to the oil and gas industry in Alaska than I. Don Young was a tireless advocate for our state's resources. He always stepped up. He was always a strong voice. You could always count on Don Young to vote in our interest. The very first bill that he helped pass in the House was for our pipeline. Imagine a state of Alaska without that pipeline. Today we're hearing that people want to dismantle the pipeline. They want to take it down. And these voices aren't coming from my side of the aisle. They're coming from the Democrat side of the aisle. The Democrats have it out for Alaska oil and gas. 66 executive orders targeting our state and counting. And we just saw the impact of that yesterday, when about 10% of the state's lands were taken offline by the Harris-Biden administration. They're no friend to Alaska, but it's completely consistent with the Democrat priorities in the House, in the Senate, and in the administration. This election is critical. We hear every cycle, someone comes up and says, you know what, this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Well, this is. This is the most important election of our lifetimes, not just for our nation, but for the people of Alaska and for the resources of Alaska. As your congressman, should you put me there, you can count on me to show up to vote in our interests, and to have your back every single day. I will always fight for us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you both. We'll now begin with our questions, and you'll have 1 minute to respond. On this first question, we'll start with Mr. Begich, and then that'll be followed by Representative Peltola. So you were both here in 2022 for a very similar forum, and at the time, permitting was the largest federal issue facing Alaska. and it remains a top issue. What specific reforms do you support in order to move projects forward? Mr. Begich.
It's a great question. We've got to make sure that we substantially reduce the time required for EIS, for EAs. We need to make sure that permitting issuance is time-boxed and those times are reduced. We need to make sure that absurd metrics that have been invented in these departments, like social costs of greenhouse gases, are eliminated. Those are impossible to quantify, and they create intended obstacles for the industry. Chevron deference being overturned, that's a great development for us, and it works in our long-term interest. But we have got to do more. At the end of the day, we need Congress to step up in their role and provide prescriptive language in the aftermath of Chevron deference being overturned, and ensure that the rights of Alaskans to develop our own resources are locked in law and don't move from one administration to the next.
Okay, thank you. Representative Peltola.
Thank you. Our federal permitting process is broken, and we need real changes to cut government red tape for good. This Congress, we took first steps in cutting red tape, streamlining project approval in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And we're working together on the House Resources Committee to see how we can add to the permitting reform package that the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee has now agreed to. We need regulatory certainty. It needs to take less time to grant a permit. The permitting process needs to be free of political interference. Permits that are granted need to stand, and we need to expedite and establish limits on court challenges for permits. Ultimately, developers need to know what is expected of them, and those expectations shouldn't change every time we have a presidential election. That's why I co-sponsored the FREE Act, to get us closer to creating jobs, boosting Alaskan projects, and expediting disaster relief.
Okay, thank you. For this next question, Representative Peltola, you will have the first response. How will you approach congressional oversight of agencies such as the EPA to ensure that agencies are not throttling resource development by overstepping regulatory authority?
I have repeatedly stood up to this administration and bureaucratic agencies when they have pursued policies that endanger our resource industry. We do resource development better than anyone else, and administrative policies will simply increase our reliance on foreign sources of oil. This threatens our national security and is worse for our economy, and it's worse for the environment. There's no question that oil from Alaska should take precedence over oil from Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and other bad actors, and I won't hesitate to call out any agency, any official who has that wrong. My actions include making bipartisan calls to end the LNG export pause and condemning administrative policies on things like ANWR, getting Willow done after decades of languishing in the process, co-sponsoring legislation to protect gas-powered utilities, and leading the call for permitting and permitting by rule reform.
Thank you. And Mr. Begich.
So Congress needs to be using its oversight authorities, power of the purse, and the Congressional Review Act to roll back the excesses of the Harris-Biden administration. The end of Chevron deference, as we mentioned, empowers the Congress and the American people to take back control of rogue federal bureaucrats in D.C. As a result, Congress must enact bills that give specific guidance to the executive branch and legislation that ensures there is not great latitude granted to these agencies. I'm hopeful that we're going to get the presidential administration back on the right side of the aisle and that we'll control both houses of Congress. And when we do, we will use the Congressional Review Act to overturn a number of these actions. Respectfully, unlike my opponent, when I see a bill like last year's Separation of Powers Restoration Act, a bill that ends bureaucratic rulemaking from the agencies, I will vote for it.
Thank you. Now, audience, I know you're really enthusiastic and we appreciate that. I'm going to ask you to hold any applause until the end so we can get through as many questions as possible. Thank you. So for this next question, Mr. Begich, you'll have the first response, followed by Representative Peltola. Another agency that has recently imposed restrictive regulations on industry is the Bureau of Land Management, with new rules to manage NPRA and a recent request for information to create additional special areas. How do you plan to address and potentially reverse these policies if serving in the U.S. House next session?
Well, once again, we have to make sure we're using every single oversight and legislative tool available to the Congress. This includes Congressional Review Act actions and bills that repeal rules, such as the so-called BLM conservation rule, that are being used to end multiple use precedent and by extension crush Alaska jobs and energy production. Unfortunately, my opponent voted against legislation that would have required rules such as these, and I'm referring to the West Act, which she voted against and would have required the BLM Conservation and Landscape Health Rule to be withdrawn. Yesterday's announcement here in the state of Alaska is a perfect example, and this is what a hostile administration to Alaska looks like, as they took another 10% of Alaska lands off the table for responsible development.
Thank you. Representative Peltola.
My voice advocating for responsible development is a powerful counterbalance to the lower 48 extremists who want to turn all of Alaska into a preserve. Instead of proper notice and robust consultation with those who stand to be most impacted, this rule and this new process have ignored those voices, especially Alaska Natives who live in the North Slope, despite numerous promises that Indigenous people will have a seat at the table in major decisions made by this administration. To be very clear, I oppose the NPRA rule and the RFI process to expand special areas. This is a federal petroleum reserve, not a federal wilderness. We need lease sales and permits we can produce responsibly without harming the environment. On the final rule, we received the lawsuits filed against it and decided that they were so strong, especially in light of the Loper-Bright overturning Chevron deference, that we didn't need to file a disapproval resolution. I'm out of time. I could keep going on this one, though.
Okay. Now is the opportunity for you to ask questions of each other. We're going to give you, the candidate will have an opportunity to ask a question. Their opponent has 1 minute to respond, and then the candidate asking the question will be given 30 seconds to respond. Representative Peltola, you may now ask Mr. Begich a question.
Nick, we've been doing this for a long time now. Over the last 3 years, you've ran against Sarah, the biggest advocate for Alaska oil we've ever had, Nancy Dahlstrom, and me, 3 lifelong Alaskans. And I convinced the Biden administration to go back on their campaign promise and to approve Willow. You even primaried Don Young, our congressman who secured the oil pipeline. A lot of us in this room are wondering whether this is more about your personal ambition than the best interests of Alaska. Why do you feel like you're more qualified than all of us, especially Don, to represent Alaska?
I appreciate you reading that question, everybody.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, this is about having a voice for all of Alaska, a voice that supports Alaska no matter what. And that was what we had with Don Young. Don Young had been there for 49 years, and he served our state well. And I think everybody in this room appreciates that long record of service. But now we've got to look forward. And as we look forward, we recognize that you have a mixed record on resource development. Not long ago, we saw the Alaska's Right to Produce Act come before the Resources Committee. And that bill was something that you co-sponsored. It hit the House floor. You then turned around and told your colleagues, actually vote no on this bill. And then when it came time to vote, you voted present. That's not the kind of leadership we expect from our representative. It's not the kind of leadership we're accustomed to with Don Young.
Thank you, Mr. Begich. Representative Peltola, you have 30 seconds to respond.
Thank you. I believe in public service, and I think most Alaskans believe in public service, and I just think it's odd that you have no record of serving the public, either on the municipal level or the state level, and you feel like you can just go straight to the top.
Okay, Mr. Begich, you may now ask Representative Peltola a question.
50, 60, it's hard to keep track of how many executive orders have been issued by the Harris-Biden administration against Alaska, specifically targeting Alaska. By last count, I heard that Alaska development is 0 for 66. Some voters thought that perhaps having a Democrat in office would be a good thing. Maybe we'd be able to make some traction with the administration. Unfortunately, it appears as if no one's listening. Why do you think it is that you have so little influence with your colleagues in the House when it comes to Alaska resources?
I think this is a funny question because, again, I was able to sit in the room with both of our senators and convince the President of the United States that we need to listen to the people of the North Slope Borough. We need to listen to Alaska Natives. AFN backed the Willow Project entirely. Alaska only works when we're all working together, and I think Willow was a perfect example of that, and it shows that I can be effective. I'm the only candidate on this stage that's brought home a resource development project and the largest renewable investment up until that date for the energy grid resilience. So I think my record speaks for itself, and I am very productive and have brought a lot of things back to Alaska.
Okay, Mr. Begich, you have 30 seconds.
So I think ConocoPhillips' record speaks for itself, because what the president said just 2 weeks after this was approved in a press conference was that his intention was to disapprove of Willow across the board, and he talked to his attorneys at Interior, and they said, if you do so, sir, you may very well lose in court. And he went on to say, if that were the case, he would be unable to do what he really wanted to do, which was to take millions of acres of Alaska lands offline permanently. We just saw that he followed through on that promise. He made no mention of your persuasive efforts.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Begich. For this next question, we're returning to the original format, so each of you will have 60 seconds to respond to the question. Representative Peltola, on this one, you will go first. In June of this year, environmental organizations filed a petition with the Department of Interior to conduct a supplemental environmental review of TAPS and to prepare a DR&R program to dismantle TAPS in the next 10 years. The petitioners have threatened to sue DOI if the request is not approved. What efforts will you take to ensure that the Department of Interior does not take adverse action, and how will you prevent Alaska from being held hostage to organizations that do not support oil and gas development? Representative Peltola.
I've stood firm against any and all efforts to target TAPS. On my watch, that pipeline is going to be refilled, not dismantled, and we're off to a great start. Getting Willow done was the biggest thing we could do in the short term to secure the survival of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And we're also very, very glad that PICA is coming along even sooner, and with the potential over time to add even more oil to the line. However, we should be prepared for more lawsuits and judicial delays. SCOTUS's decision in Corner Post means essentially that there's no statute of limitations for litigation. I'll continue to advocate for and support legislation that reforms judicial review and for development and limits on who can file suit against projects. We cannot allow Alaskan development and self-determination to be stymied by lower 48 interests, and I'll do everything I can to ensure Interior and other agencies recognize the priority Alaskans ought to have in conversations regarding our own development.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Begich.
Imagine for a minute a state of Alaska with no pipeline. We'd have some of the highest taxes in the world, half the population, no PFD. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're a resource state. If you don't think it can happen here, just look at how hard the environmental radical left down in the lower 48 pushed against the Keystone XL pipeline. We need reforms to NEPA, we need reforms to the ESA, we need reforms to the Clean Water Act, and more is necessary to ensure that vital projects actually start in our state. Let's be clear, if Democrats control Congress, AOC will become the chair of the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. And I just want to take a moment, take a show of hands. Who would like to see AOC as the chair of that subcommittee for Alaska? That's what a Democrat vote means. I didn't see any hand raised in this room. Just remember that. That's what's at stake.
Okay, Mr. Begich, you will have the first response to this question. In his video address to us
I-
earlier today.
wait, Michelle?
Yes.
I need a turn.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I guess you do. Go right ahead.
Thank you. PL 5150 was established to guarantee federal access along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. TAP's construction ended in 1977, but the PLO remains in place. Wait, am I even on the right question? Okay,
That's
never mind.
okay.
I don't need a turn. You were
Okay,
right.
very good.
I'm a mic hog. Sorry,
Back
guys.
on track. Okay. Mr. Begich, you'll have the first response to this question. In his video address to us earlier today, Senator Sullivan discussed the 66 federal agency actions against Alaska and was recently at AOGA's offices for a press conference to discuss a letter he sent to BLM Director Tracy Stone Manning asking for correspondence related to many issues, including her decision to abandon the process to lift Public Land Order 5150, which would have conveyed land back to the state. Do you support lifting public land orders? If so, how will you work with the state and DOI to accomplish it?
I absolutely support lifting public land orders. These orders were issued in the 70s and intended as many government programs to be temporary. As we know, it seldom proves to be the case. Once a government program goes into place, they never seem to go away. Over 50 million acres of Alaska lands remained under PLOs today. And we just saw yesterday, again, the Harris-Biden administration has no intention of lifting these public land orders. Here again is why elections matter. And it's part of the reason why the House Resources Committee Chair, Bruce Westerman, endorsed me this morning. He knows that I will be a tireless champion for Alaska's resources in the House and will leverage every opportunity to force the lifting of these PLOs through committee amendments and must pass legislation in order to make sure that Alaska retains the right to produce our own resources.
Okay, thank you. Representative Peltola.
Thanks, Michelle. Alaska, let me see. The state of Alaska developed a compromise on PLO 5150 that just about everyone can accept. The legislature, thank you to all the legislators in the room, helped pass legislation to ensure subsistence access would be protected, but BLM abruptly shut that process down. Senator Murkowski, Senator Sullivan, and I have asked them why. In general, I do support lifting public land orders through a responsible public process. It's possible that not every last acre of PLO will be lifted, but we can't be in a position where they remain in place forever without any real reason as to why. Many of those lands should be open to multiple use and potential economic development, which would be permitted separately. Most importantly, I believe we need certainty and continuity between administrations. Alaskans are getting whiplash from changing regulatory regimes, which is dangerous for the nation and especially harmful to our state, where we desperately need infrastructure and energy development.
Okay, thank you. The next question will be answered first by Representative Peltola. The DOI approved a 5-year OCS lease sale, 2024 to 2029, and it did not include a lease sale in the Cook Inlet. The Biden-Harris administration canceled the 2022 Cook Inlet lease sale. Should lease sales continue on federal land in Alaska? If so, what will you do as our representative in Congress to ensure stable, predictable lease sales on federal land in Alaska?
Absolutely. We should be holding regular lease sales on federal lands in Alaska, including in Cook Inlet, in the NPRA, and on the coastal plain as required by law. We need those to bolster resource development and create jobs for Alaskans across the state. You cannot tell me that it is better to import LNG than it is to produce our own gas from our own Cook Inlet. I have a record of pushing for lease sales, from introducing the Alaska Energy Production and Fisheries Protection Act, co-sponsoring the FREE Act to tackle permitting reform, and championing changes in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that should make development easier. I've taken direct action to make the process of buying a lease, surveying the land, and beginning resource development easier, less bureaucratic, and more predictable. I was the only Democrat on the National Resources Committee to support legislation requiring 3 lease sales in Alaska and 10 in the Gulf of Mexico over the next 5 years. I'll continue to be a leader within my party supporting needed and responsible energy development around the nation, and especially in Alaska.
Thank you, Representative Peltola. Mr. Begich.
Nothing illustrates the tone-deaf nature of a Washington, D.C. Democrat like the war on Cook Inlet gas. Cook Inlet gas production is in dire straits. We just heard that in the presentation that started this panel. And it's critically necessary that we have production in the Cook Inlet for South Central Alaska. We need to make sure that these lease sales are predictable, reliable, and as your representative, I would support important legislation like the Bridge Production Act that predictably mandates future leases in the Cook Inlet. We also need to make sure that we have consistency as our lone voice in the House. We need to make sure that that person is always going to be there for our state. We can't have a representative voting present. We have to have a representative voting yes for the people of the state of Alaska.
Okay, thank you. So we mentioned that permitting is one of the top federal issues facing Alaska, but on a state level, increasing taxes is always a threat, either in the legislature or via the ballot box. How did you vote in 2014 and 2020 on the ballot measures that would have increased taxes? And what is your view on current taxation in Alaska? Mr. Begich, you will have the first response.
So I voted against raising taxes on the industry in 2014. I voted again against raising taxes on the industry in 2020. And in fact, in 2020, I was a co-chair of the One Alaska campaign, which, as many people in this room know, was an effort that stood up to fight back against these absurd oil tax proposals. Look, attractive tax rates are important, but what's also important is making sure that you have a predictable tax regime. And unfortunately, this is constantly being challenged by the Democrat Party here in Alaska and the National Democrat Party. In addition, Kamala Harris's dramatic proposals on increasing taxes across the board, Democrats on the Energy and Mineral Development Subcommittee are pushing for higher taxes, royalties, and increased lease fees for oil and gas. Remember, the most important vote that a member takes is for the Speaker of the House, and when Mary Peltola votes for the Speaker of the House to be a Democrat, she's signing us up for the Democrat agenda.
Okay, thank you. We have time for a few audience questions, and this first one...
I really didn't answer that one, though.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Man, we are really... That's on me.
And I did
Peltola.
vote to table the motion to vacate the current Speaker of the House, and I'm very proud of that vote that I took. Alaskans are struggling right now. I'm a regular Alaskan who understands how high prices are and how hard it is to provide for yourself and your family. We need to invest in Alaskans and support economic development. That's why I'm proud to have worked with both of our senators to secure more than $8.2 billion in infrastructure investments into our state, bringing hundreds of millions in funding for Rail Belt Energy Grid and securing hundreds of millions of dollars in seafood purchases to support our most vulnerable. I oppose the 2014 and 2020 measures, and I would oppose similar measures to raise taxes. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. All right, we do have a little bit of time for some audience questions, and so this first one I'll ask both of you to respond to, and we'll have Representative Peltola respond first. Hold on, I'm scrolling. Okay, the question is, what can you do to protect Alaskans from unrealistic energy goals like 100% carbon-free energy by 2035 or a carbon zero aviation sector by 2050?
So I worked on the FAA reauthorization on the low lead aviation fuel avgas. And Senator Sullivan and I secured a 6-year extension for Alaska. We were going for a 10-year extension, but we weren't able to do that. We were able to pull off 6 years, though, because it's an untested product, and we really need to make sure we have the infrastructure for avgas at all of our airports. I will be a constant and continuous advocate for affordable energy across Alaska. I recognize that gas and oil will always be part of our energy portfolio in Alaska and the United States. We recognize that even with a lot of renewable energy, there's always going to be a need for about 20% of petroleum product to make sure that our energy is stable because of storage issues with the other ways that we get energy. I am a reasonable, practical person, and I am articulate, and I'm able to explain Alaska to the lower 48, and I will always continue to do that. And I feel like I do have a long record of recognizing our energy challenges across Alaska and across the United States and working to find solutions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Begich, would you like me to read the question again?
That would be great.
Okay,
Thanks.
all right. What can you do to protect Alaskans from unrealistic energy goals, like 100% carbon-free energy by 2035, or a carbon zero aviation sector by 2050?
Yeah, these are unrealistic, and I'm not even sure they should be goals at all. We look at how the left in this country has weaponized what I'm going to call the carbon lie or the carbon economy, right? And they've weaponized it against everyone in this room. They are trying to use these methodologies to shut us down. And the first thing that you got to do is you got to be willing to stand up in the Congress and call them out on this. You can't accept the lie on its face, right? And I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to do it here. I'm willing to do it in D.C. Secondly, we've got to use our power on the Resources Committee to make sure that we are passing bills that repeal these attempted actions. We've talked about Chevron deference and the restoration of powers to the Congress. Well, now the Congress has to use those powers. And we've got to use those powers in committee to make sure that on must-pass legislation, we're pushing back against the carbon lie, and that's what I'm going to do.
Okay, thank you. All right, I have one question for each of you, and this first one will go to Representative Peltola from the audience. The question is, why have you missed so many crucial votes in Congress, including overturning the unconstitutional cancellation of ANWR leases and the SPRA, or HR 21?
I have had a series of tragic things happen in my family, and my hope is that in the next 2 years, my mother and my husband don't die.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Begich, as you look to potential future colleagues in the U.S. House, who would you look to for mentorship, and who would you like to build coalitions or relationships with?
It's a great question. I think the House Resources Committee is a great place to start. These are people that are interested, dedicating this portion of their career politically to ensuring that Alaska and America generally has the ability to develop our God-given resources, whether that be minerals, whether that be oil and gas, whether that be coal. That we have the ability to develop those resources. I think that committee is full of folks like Chairman Westerman who would be fantastic mentors stepping in as a freshman in the House. And there's a number of challenges that we have, but I'm here to work for Alaska if you'll put me there. And my primary goal is going to be making sure that we open up this state.
Okay, I actually have one more question for the two of you. And then we'll go to your closing comments. So, where do you stand on Vice President Harris's proposed tax policy, which seeks to tax unrealized capital gains and significantly raise the corporate income tax? Mr. Begich, you'll go first.
100% opposed. And let me be clear why. These taxes are confiscatory. She wants to dramatically increase not just corporate income taxes, but as was mentioned, dramatic increases on even unrealized capital gains. This is a wealth tax, folks. And it's the kind of thing that you see in socialist governments, in communist governments. It belies a complete lack of understanding of basic economics and capitalism, and it's an actual threat, not just to this industry, but to the investment climate in our country generally. This is dangerous stuff. And to see a presidential candidate in this day and age put forward proposals like this should concern every single person in this room. If we're going to attract investment to the state of Alaska, we need a favorable investment climate, and Harris is single-handedly attempting to shut that down.
Okay, Representative Peltola, would you like me to read the question again?
Sure.
Okay. Where do you stand on Vice President Harris's proposed tax policy, which seeks to tax unrealized capital gains and significantly raise the corporate income tax.
I am completely and totally opposed to that, like many of the policies that she has voted on in the past. I have not endorsed her and her bid for the presidency because of this good example and many other good examples. I'm not sure that that policy agenda is one that I would ever back or vouch for, and I would be a very vocal proponent against it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have come to the time for closing comments. Each candidate will have 1 minute for closing remarks, and in doing so, please tell us why you are the best candidate to advocate for the long-term viability of the oil and gas industry. Mr. Begich will go first, followed by Representative Peltola.
So after today's forum, I hope it's clear that I'm the one candidate on this stage who will not waver in advocating for Alaskan oil and gas. These are critical jobs for Alaskan families, critical industry that powers our state. It's critical opportunities for future generations. Alaska is a resource state, and I understand that better than anyone in this race. It's why the House Resources Committee Chair himself, Bruce Westerman, endorsed me today. He's somebody who has had the opportunity to get to know Representative Peltola over the last 2 years, and he made that decision. Energy and minerals are key to our national and economic security, and Alaska has the opportunity to provide that foundation as we reestablish these domestic supply chains. Most of us in this room knew Don Young. Don Young was a tireless advocate for us, never backing down from a fight, never voting present when we needed him to be there for us. We need that fighter again for Alaska, and I want to be that fighter for you.
Okay, Representative Peltola.
Thank you. We all know that Alaska only works when we're working together. All the great leaders who built our state understand the importance of putting Alaska first and delivering for Alaskans. Over the last 2 years, our delegation that you sent to DC has been working across party lines to invest in the future of our state. All of us believe in the importance of building a future for our state, of making sure that we have world-class infrastructure, that we have the capacity for future growth across our industries, and that every Alaskan is connected to the world through high-speed broadband. Getting things done means working with anyone for Alaska's greater good. I'm proud to say that about half the legislation I have co-sponsored have been Republican bills. That's why I have never been afraid to challenge the administration when they make decisions that are not good for Alaska. One of my priorities from day one was to help lower 48ers understand that we do resource extraction right in Alaska, and the importance of our resource industries for the future of energy independence and national security.
Thank you, Representative Peltola.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you once more for being here today, for preparing as you did, and for your commitment to our state. And I know the audience wants to join me in giving you a warm round of applause.